Okay, welcome to chapter 14, the Judiciary. In this chapter, I titled this Trump versus the Federal Courts because I kind of wanted to make it a little more interesting than just going over the judiciary branch of our government. So I kind of wanted to, touch on Donald Trump and his battle against the Ninth Circuit, which is out of San Francisco, which is California, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, and Alaska. And so what we're going to do in this chapter is I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court and the federal courts, but I'm also going to just talk about Donald Trump's relationship, especially with the Ninth Circuit. Okay, the Ninth Circuit is one of the more prestigious circuits, as opposed to probably the second and third or in fifth. So in this chapter, we're going to look at how the role of the Supreme Court and our judiciary branch of government and what exactly do they do. Okay. Okay, so one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about judiciary system, the judiciary system is our court system, and it's one of the three branches of our government here in the United States. And as such, the Supreme Court is dictated by constitutional law. Okay, the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Constitution is the highest law of our land. No law trumps the Constitution. Okay, and so when we're looking at the Constitution, we're looking at some things such as how the court makes its decisions, and one of the ways is through precedents, where a court's decision is furnished as an example and authority for deciding subsequent cases involving identical or similar facts. So when we're talking about precedent, usually the court, especially the Supreme Court, will go based on a previous decision. That's how normally we've done it, and they will look at a previous case in order to, and I'm trying to make sure I make this simple enough so I don't confuse you. When we look at precedent is basically, well, we're looking at a previous case that happened 50 years ago, and the common law. When we're talking about common law, it's basically a body of laws developed from judicial decisions in our courts, in the U.S. court system, which we got from the English. Okay, and so now, just because something is set in precedent doesn't mean a Supreme Court will depart from said precedent. For instance, Brown versus the Board of Education. In Brown v. Board of Education, the separate educational facilities for African Americans have been upheld as constitutional in many earlier cases under separate but equal doctrine. One thing we found out through the separate but equal doctrine is separate but equal does not work, because even though it's separate, it's not. It's more times than not, it's not going to be equal, and we all know that. If you live in certain communities, just schools across town, usually when you're on the north side of town or on the north side of the tracks, so to speak, and you're going to have a better quality of education than if you're on the south side of that same town. Okay. So what I've done with this chapter is we're looking at Donald Trump versus the Ninth Circuit, and one of the things that the Ninth Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals, so it's gone through the district courts at the lower level. It's been when it gets to the appeal, the Ninth Circuit of Appeals, it's because somebody's appealing it, and 9 times out of 10, it's the Trump administration appealing what, for instance, Sacramento is suing them for, and Sacramento will win at the lower court. Then it goes to the Court of Appeals. So when we talk about Donald Trump versus the Ninth Circuit, we're talking about presidential powers. Okay. Now the president does have the power to issue executive orders. The problem is let me let me read what an executive order is. When we're looking at executive orders, they're presidential orders to carry out a policy or policies not described in law passed by Congress. So if Congress hasn't passed it, then the president can executive order it. Now, when we talk about executive orders, they will only last as long as the next president wants them to be in effect. Okay, we're seeing a lot of this with Donald Trump's executive orders. He's what he's doing is making executive orders, especially things that Obama had already made an executive order. So like Obama would make an executive order for something, Donald Trump will repeal that executive order and put one in its place, one that's more beneficial to him and his allies. We're looking at the Donald Trump and the federal courts. We're looking at, and I did it like this. In this corner, Donnie from Brooklyn versus the Ninth Circuit, and which is in Sacramento. I'm sorry, the Ninth Circuit is in San Francisco. So you have Donald Trump versus the Ninth Circuit, and one of the things they're arguing over is this idea of checks and balances. Does the court, and we're seeing this also with Congress and Donald Trump, does the court is it the job of the court to check the executive branch, especially when the executive branch has been out of order? And when we're talking about states' rights as well as federal, we're talking about a separation of powers. In our system of government, not only do we have checks and balances, but we also have separation of powers, where the states have a certain amount of power and the federal government has a certain amount of power. The state of California, especially when it comes to the emissions, carbon emissions, California's first of all, the federal government is arguing that California's standards are too high, and the Trump administration wants to lower them. California's arguing no, they need to be higher because we want to have clean air. We want to have air that's clean. We're trying to make sure the Earth is around in another 100 years for our future generations. Okay. Now, some people don't believe in climate change. They don't think the Earth is. They just believe. There's some people in our society that tend to believe that this is just a cycle of the Earth. Like this is something that just happens, and if we and I'm gonna just be very frank, there are people out there who think that this is just the way God wants it, and however God wants it, that's the way it's supposed to be. So when we're talking about the courts and the Trump administration, the courts have ruled and said that maximum power does not mean absolute power. Every presidential action must still comply with the limits set by Congress's deregulation of power and the constraints of the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights. It is a bedrock principle of this nation's legal system that the Constitution ought to be the standard of construction for the laws, and that wherever there is evident opposition, the laws ought to give place to the Constitution. This is in Federalist 81, which Alexander Hamilton wrote. And then the Establishment Clause, concerns discussed above do not involve an assessment of merits of the presidential national security judgment. Instead, the question is whether the executive order was so animated by the national security concerns at all, as opposed to impermissible motive of disfavoring one religious group. So this is when we're talking about a Establishment Clause, so this what the court is arguing, and this is one of the things. When you argue the Baker case, the case of the baker who doesn't want to doesn't want to make the cake for the gay couple. Well, the argument is the baker's arguing two things. One is religious freedom, the other one is freedom of expression, which is art, right? And so with the Establishment Clause, especially when it comes to executive branch, and let's say the president favors the baker, the president can argue in favor of and say, especially if it has something to do with national security judgment. Now, it's the Trump administration, and I know somebody's going to sit there and say, well, what does national security have to do with the baker? It really doesn't. And if you listen to some of the arguments that the Trump administration makes to the Court of Appeals, the federal court, the lower federal courts, the Court of Appeals, and even to the Supreme Court, some of the arguments have been just that. It's a national security concern. See, because when it's national security, and we're learning this right now with the impeachment process, the Trump administration is arguing, that phone conversation was a violation of national security. So, so the whistleblower is not necessarily is not necessarily doing the right thing because this is a national security issue, right? Well, when other people in the room have heard this conversation with regard to the president and his and that phone call to the Ukrainian president, other people have confirmed with the what the whistleblower was saying. That's why a few weeks ago I had you read the whistleblower's report, because and some of you argued, well, this is secondhand information. Well, when we're talking about national security, a lot of national security issues will be secondhand information. Of course, it's going to be secondhand information, and then that's why you do the investigation. Because one thing we learned since it became secondhand information, we've also learned that this is now beyond the scope of secondhand information. There are people who actually listened to the call and they sat there and said the president was doing quid pro quo, which is I'll do something for you, but you got to do something for me. The president was using his position to get the Ukrainian president to investigate one of the president's political opponents, which is not good. When we look at checks and balances in our system, this is where the impeachment process. So when we're looking at Congress, and so when we're looking at the checks and balances, we're looking at Congress. Congress can impeach and remove the president from office. When we're looking at that, so the House of Representatives does the impeachment. Okay, that they bring the case against the president. The U.S. Senate is the jury. So all 100 members of the U.S. Senate is the jury. So they will listen to the case. Okay, we got that so far? Okay. The executive branch and their attorneys, the president has his own attorneys, is the defense. And so when we're looking at this, the president has a right to defend himself in the impeachment process. When we look at the Supreme Court, the role of the judicial branch, the Chief Justice, unless he recuses himself, will sit on as the judge of this case. Okay, so how our checks and balances work is Congress's job to impeach the president is up to the Senate, and once the Chief Justice hears the case, the Senate's job will be to vote to remove or to keep him, and he has to have there has to be 2/3 majority, so that's 67 votes has to be in favor of the removal of the president of the United States from his position, which in some cases, some people are arguing that that'll never happen. But John Roberts, who's our current Chief Justice of the United States, would be the judge presiding over that case if it gets that far. Now, when we're looking at all this and the role of the judiciary branch is supposed to be independent. This is why the judges are there for life, and there's 9 of them, and the judges are there for life, and they hear cases. Okay, they bring, and not all cases that are sent to the Supreme Court make it to be heard. Very few. So a lot of cases that go to the Court of Appeals. Whatever the Court of Appeals rule, and then the Supreme Court refuses to hear the case, that judgment stands at the Court of Appeals. Okay, so they cannot be overturned. Only time it's overturned is if the Supreme Court hears the case and goes against what the Court of Appeals has said. And so, when you go into chapter 14 and read the chapter, you'll get more information. I think it's conducive for you to actually read the chapter to get a better understanding of our court system. And so what I did this week was kind of just give you a quick overview of Donald Trump and the federal courts and how they're constantly, right now they're at odds. And it's really California. Sacramento tends to sue Donald Trump quite often, or Donald Trump will sue Sacramento. And what'll happen is 9 times out of 10 with a lot of these cases, Donald Trump has lost against Sacramento, because Sacramento pretty much argues the law. And we just recently saw where a judge in D.C., which is the First Circuit, threw out Donald Trump's case for his taxes, because the law states that Congress has a right to see his taxes. The Congress has a right to see all your taxes, all of our taxes, if they request it. And not even the president can hide his taxes. Thank you. That's all, folks, for this week. I'll see you next week. And if you need anything, please feel free to either message me in Canvas for any work-related assignments, and you can text me or email me if you have anything that's personal, that has nothing to do with the homework assignments, because you're going through something personal in your personal life. Thank you. Have a super day. Okay, great.